the war leader who starved millions. He saved Western civilization. That is what the history books say. And they are not wrong. But history books have a habit of framing the story before you've had the chance to ask the right questions. They hand you the portrait and call it the truth. They give you the statue and forget the man underneath. Winston Spencer Churchill. Born into a palace. Died a legend. But between those 2 points, between the silver spoon and the bronze monument, there is a life so complicated, so contradictory, so achingly human, that the real story is not one of simple heroism. It is a story of power, of sacrifice, of conviction, and of the terrible price that conviction can demand. Sometimes not from the man who holds it, but from those who never had a say in the matter at all. So before we celebrate, before we quote the speeches, before we pour the scotch, before we raise a toast to the Lion of Britain, let us ask the question that statues are not built to answer. What does it cost to be the man who saves the world? And who pays the bill? A boy born in the wrong direction. He was born on the 30th of November, 1874, in a room he had no business being born in. Blenheim Palace. One of the grandest private homes in all of England. 300 rooms, 10 acres of gardens, fountains that seemed to believe they were in a different century entirely. This was the world that greeted Winston Churchill on the day he arrived, 7 weeks too early, life already impatient with him before he'd taken a single breath. His father was Lord Randolph Churchill, a brilliant, charismatic, and deeply unstable politician who burned through his career the way some men burn through money, spectacularly, and with a certain tragic flair. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American heiress with dark eyes and a social intelligence so sharp it could cut glass. Together, they were magnificent. Together, they were largely absent. Winston adored them both with the desperate, grasping love of a child who understands, without being told, that he is not quite the priority he imagined himself to be. He wrote letters home from boarding school, Harrow, letters that are difficult to read, not because they are eloquent, but because they are not. They are the letters of a boy pleading, in his small, uncertain handwriting, for someone to come and visit. Please come, Mother. Please come, Father. I haven't seen you in so long. The visits rarely came. What came instead was ambition. A ferocious, consuming, almost pathological need to prove something, to his father, to his world, to history itself. Lord Randolph had dismissed his son as intellectually average, had looked at the boy and seen nothing remarkable. Winston filed that dismissal away somewhere deep, and he would spend the next 7 decades proving it wrong. He was not academically gifted in the conventional sense. He failed to get into Sandhurst, the Royal Military College, twice. The third attempt, he succeeded. And even this felt like something he had wrenched from the world, by sheer force of will, rather than natural grace. When Lord Randolph Churchill died in 1895, at just 45 years old, his mind fragmented, his reputation in tatters, Winston was 20 years old. He stood at the funeral and felt, alongside grief, something else. A door closing. The chance to finally earn his father's approval, gone forever. Some men, at that moment, would have softened, would have turned inward. Winston Churchill turned outward, toward war. The British Empire, at the close of the 19th century, was the largest political structure the world had ever seen. It covered a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed a quarter of its people. And young Winston Churchill intended to see every inch of it. He served in India. He rode with the cavalry at the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan, one of the last great cavalry charges in history, a thundering, brilliant, and deeply colonial act of violence that he would later describe with the unrestrained enthusiasm of a man who had not yet learned to interrogate his own excitement. He was captured in the Boer War in South Africa, and then he escaped, slipping over a wall in the dark, alone, with no plan and no map, walking miles through hostile territory until he found safety. He was 25 years old. He turned the story into a book. The book made him famous. The fame, he understood with the instinct of a natural politician, was the first brick in the wall of something much larger. By the time he entered Parliament in 1900, Winston Churchill already had a mythology. He had authored himself before the world had the chance to define him. He was not just a politician. He was a character, and that distinction, subtle as it seems, would matter enormously in the decades ahead. His early political career was turbulent, unpredictable, and frequently infuriating to everyone around him. He crossed the floor of the House of Commons, switching parties from conservative to liberal, a move that earned him a reputation for disloyalty that he would never entirely shed. He was brilliant in debate, devastating in rhetoric, but often accused of prioritizing spectacle over substance. He was First Lord of the Admiralty when the First World War arrived in 1914, and he threw himself into it with characteristic ferocity. He championed the Gallipoli campaign, a bold, sweeping plan to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war by seizing control of the Dardanelles Strait. It was audacious. It was visionary. It was a catastrophe. Over 250,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded in 8 months of futile fighting on those sun-bleached cliffs. Churchill was held responsible. He was stripped of his position, sent to political exile, and for a time it seemed as though his career, so golden, so full of promise, had died on the beaches of Gallipoli alongside all those young men. He went to the Western Front himself, served in the trenches, stood in the mud with the men he had sent there. Whether this was guilt or courage or both, is a question history cannot cleanly answer. The man the world chose to ignore. The 1930s were, by almost any measure, the most important decade of the 20th century. And for most of that decade, Winston Churchill was largely irrelevant. He was in his 50s and 60s, out of office, writing books, painting landscapes at his country home at Chartwell, running up debts at an alarming rate, and warning anyone who would listen about the rise of Adolf Hitler. Almost no one wanted to listen. The prevailing mood in Britain was exhaustion. A generation had been swallowed by the First World War. The idea that another war might be coming, that it was being deliberately chosen, engineered in Berlin by a man with a toothbrush mustache and an apocalyptic vision, seemed, to many, like the paranoid fantasy of an aging warmonger. Chamberlain's policy of appeasement was not simply cowardice. It was, in its own way, a reasonable response to an unreasonable fear, the terror of repeating 1914. Churchill saw it differently. He stood in Parliament and said, with a directness that made his colleagues uncomfortable, that peace purchased by surrender was not peace at all. He called the Munich Agreement of 1938, in which Britain and France handed Czechoslovakia to Hitler in exchange for a piece of paper, a total and unmitigated defeat. Not with sadness, with fury. He was laughed at. He was patronized. The Conservative Party, of which he was a member, largely wished he would stop embarrassing them. These were the wilderness years. And they are important not because they were dramatic, but because they were not. They were years of stubborn, thankless, politically costly truth-telling in a climate that was not ready to hear it. The quality that made Churchill effective in the 1940s was forged in the 1930s, when there was nothing to be gained from saying what he was saying. He said it anyway. That is not nothing. That is, perhaps, the most important thing. On the 10th of May, 1940, two things happened simultaneously. Germany invaded France and the Low Countries, sweeping through the Ardennes in a blitzkrieg that shattered every Allied strategic assumption within 72 hours. And Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain. He was 65 years old. He had wanted this his entire life. And it had arrived at the worst possible moment in British history. The man he replaced, Neville Chamberlain, had the decency to look hollowed out as he left Downing Street. Churchill walked in with a different expression. Those who were there that day reported that he seemed, despite everything, almost calm, almost relieved, as if he had been waiting in a very long queue and had finally reached the front. He would later write that on the night he became Prime Minister, he felt as if he were walking with destiny, as if his whole life had been a preparation for this trial. 3 weeks later, the entire British expeditionary force was trapped on a beach in northern France. Dunkirk. 330,000 men, pinned between the sea and the German army, waiting to die. What followed was not a victory. Let us be precise about that. The evacuation of Dunkirk was a miracle of improvisation, of collective courage, of fishermen and ferrymen crossing the channel in wooden boats with German shells falling around them. But it was also a defeat. Britain had lost France. Britain had lost its army's equipment, its position, its allies. Britain was, for all practical purposes, alone. And Churchill stood up and called it glorious. Not because he was deluded, not because he was performing, but because he understood, with a clarity that bordered on the artistic, that the story a nation tells itself in its darkest hour is not separate from its survival. It is its survival. On the 4th of June, 1940, he addressed Parliament. His words did not pretend the situation was anything other than desperate. But in the desperation, he planted something. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Read those words on a page, and they are extraordinary. Hear them delivered, and Churchill's delivery was deliberate, heavy, like each word had been personally selected and carried to the microphone, and they are something else. They are a decision. A collective decision, spoken by one man, on behalf of a people who had not yet been asked but who felt, hearing those words, that they had somehow already chosen. He made 6 major speeches in those first months of the war. Each one landed differently. Some were defiant. Some were solemn. Some, like his tribute to the pilots of the Royal Air Force. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, had the compressed, immortal quality of something written for the ages. He was not simply communicating a position. He was building a reality, constructing, word by word, a version of Britain that Britain could believe in and therefore become. All through the Blitz, through the nights when London burned, when people slept in the underground and emerged each morning to find their streets had been rearranged by German bombs, Churchill moved through the rubble. He visited bomb sites. He shook hands. He gave the V sign. He was photographed in his siren suit, wearing it with the complete self-possession of a man to whom dignity was not dependent on what he was wearing. He was not hiding. He was not hiding. Was there fear? Almost certainly. Churchill was not a simple man. He suffered from what he called his black dog, a deep, recurring depression that had followed him for decades, appearing in the quiet hours, sitting on his chest in the dark. To carry that and still stand upright in the ruins of a bombed city, cigar in hand, giving the V sign for the cameras, that is not performance. Or not only performance. That is will. Now we need to stop. Because while Churchill was the hero of one story, and the evidence for his heroism is real, it is documented, it changed the history of the world, he was also a participant in another story. One that is less comfortable to tell. One that statues do not generally choose to commemorate. In 1943, as the Second World War ground toward its turning point, a famine swept through the Bengal region of India. It killed between 2 and 3 million people. Perhaps more. The precise numbers are still debated by historians, which is itself a kind of obscenity, that we are still debating the scale of a hunger that consumed millions of human lives while the British Empire watched. The famine was not caused by Churchill alone. The causes were complex: a catastrophic cyclone that destroyed harvests, wartime disruptions to supply chains, speculation and hoarding by local merchants, a global shipping crisis. Bengal was already vulnerable. But what happened next, or rather, what did not happen, is where Churchill enters the story. Requests for emergency food shipments to Bengal were made to the War Cabinet. Churchill's government declined them, or delayed them, or redirected the ships to stockpile food in Europe for the anticipated post-war period. Churchill's own recorded comments about India during this period are not easy to dismiss as the views of a man who simply didn't know. He knew. He was informed. The Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, reported that Churchill's response to the famine, when briefed on it, included comments so contemptuous of Indian lives that Amery, a man who was himself no radical anti-imperialist, confided to his diary that he could see no difference between Churchill's attitudes and those of Adolf Hitler on the question of subject peoples. Churchill believed, with a conviction rooted in the Victorian imperialism of his upbringing, that India was Britain's to govern. He opposed Indian independence with a ferocity that went beyond political calculation. He spoke of Indians in terms that reflected not just a political position but a hierarchy, a belief that some peoples were closer to civilization than others, and that the British Empire was the vanguard of the civilized. This is not a re-evaluation imposed by 21st century standards on a man who could not have known better. His contemporaries challenged him. Indian leaders challenged him. Members of his own government challenged him. He held the line. And in Bengal, in 1943, while Churchill gave his speeches and Britain stood alone against Nazi tyranny, millions of people learned what it meant to be on the wrong side of his compassion. How do we hold this? How do we hold the man who defied Hitler alongside the man who, it is argued with considerable evidence, helped create the conditions for millions to starve? The honest answer is, with difficulty. With the kind of difficulty that resists the neat resolution of a YouTube comment or a statue. The kind of difficulty that asks us to sit with discomfort rather than resolve it too quickly in either direction. Because Churchill was not a monster. He was not simply a hero either. He was a man of his time, which is both an explanation and an indictment. His imperialism was not unusual for his class and era. But not unusual and not harmful are not the same thing. The people of Bengal were not less dead because their deaths were consistent with the prevailing ideology of the British ruling class. In July 1945, 2 months after Germany surrendered, the British people went to the polls. And they voted Winston Churchill out of office. The man who had led them through their darkest hour, who had arguably saved their civilization, who had given them their finest hour. They looked at him, and they chose someone else. Churchill was devastated. His wife, Clementine, is reported to have told him it might be a blessing in disguise. He replied that if so, the disguise was very effective. The result shocked the world. It did not shock historians who understood what the British people were actually saying, that they loved Churchill for the war. They had simply decided they wanted someone different to build the peace. They wanted the welfare state. They wanted the National Health Service, which Labour's Attlee government would go on to create. They had fought and sacrificed and endured, and they wanted something permanent in return, not just survival, but dignity. Security. The kind of country worth fighting for. Churchill had given them the survival. He did not speak the language of what came next. He returned to Downing Street once more, in 1951, as an old man. The energy that had electrified the 1940s was diminished. He suffered a stroke in 1953 that was concealed from the public. He clung to power longer than many felt was wise, reluctant, unable to leave the stage. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953, which was, in its own way, one of the more honest recognitions in the history of that prize. Because whatever else can be said about Winston Churchill, he was a writer. A real one. His histories, his memoirs, his speeches, they constitute one of the most remarkable bodies of prose produced by a political figure in the English language. The history of the English-speaking peoples. The 6-volume history of the Second World War. Thousands of articles, dispatches, and speeches spanning 60 years. He won the prize not as a consolation gesture, but because the work was genuinely extraordinary. He retired finally in 1955. He was 80 years old. He spent his final decade at Chartwell and in the south of France, painting. He was a gifted, if amateur, painter, and watching, from a distance, the empire he had loved and defended and refused to relinquish begin, inevitably, to dissolve. India had become independent in 1947. The process of decolonization he had fought against was proceeding with, or without his blessing. The world was becoming something he had not imagined and did not entirely understand. He died on the 24th of January, 1965, exactly 70 years to the day after his father. His state funeral drew more heads of state than any occasion in British history. Over 300 million people watched it on television around the world. The coffin, borne on the Thames on a barge, passed under cranes that had been lowered in salute. Workers along the riverbank dipped their heads. Even the cranes bowed. There is a statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square, London. During the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, protesters spray-painted the words, "Was a racist," beneath his name. The graffiti was cleaned off. A few days later, it appeared again. Then it was cleaned again. This back and forth, this argument with a piece of bronze, captures something essential about who we are as a species and how we handle the complicated dead. We want our heroes unambiguous. We want the good men to have been good all the way through, in every room, in every decision, in every corner of their enormous and consequential lives. And when we discover that they were not, that the man who defied Hitler also held views about empire and race that contributed to preventable mass death, we don't quite know what to do with our hands. So we argue about the statue. But the statue is not the point. The point is that Churchill, at his best, demonstrated something genuinely rare, the willingness to hold an unpopular truth and speak it in a room full of people who did not want to hear it, at considerable cost to himself, for year after thankless year, until the moment finally arrived when the truth he'd been carrying was the only thing standing between civilization and the dark. That is real. That happened. It mattered enormously. And the point is also that the same Churchill, the same mind, the same will, the same force of conviction, looked at Bengal and made choices that cannot be cleanly separated from the deaths of millions. Both things are true. Simultaneously. Without resolution. Power does not simplify people. It amplifies them. It takes whatever is already there, the courage and the compassion, but also the blindness and the arrogance, and it projects it onto the world at a scale that ordinary life never permits. Churchill's virtues were amplified to heroic scale. So were his failures. And here is the question that this story exists to leave with you. If you had been Winston Churchill in 1940 carrying the exhaustion of his career, the weight of that Black Dog Depression, the ridicule of the wilderness years, the responsibility of a civilization's survival, and you had also carried, in your chest, the same imperial assumptions he carried, the same hierarchy of human value that the British ruling class breathed in like air, would you have done differently? Not in the abstract. Not as the person you imagine yourself to be, looking back from the safety of the present, but as him, in his moment, with his formation, his assumptions, his pressures, his knowledge. Would you have sent the ships to Bengal? There is no comfortable answer. And that discomfort is not a problem to be solved. It is a lesson to be learned. About power. About how we choose our heroes. About what we are willing to overlook in the people we need, and what that willingness costs those who are not in the room when the decision is made. Churchill used to say that history would be kind to him, because he intended to write it. He did write it. And it was kind to him, for a while. Now history is being rewritten. Not to erase him. Not to replace the statue. But to make the picture larger. To include in the frame the faces and the voices that the original portrait left out. That is not an attack on Churchill. That is history doing its actual job. Every powerful figure casts a shadow. The greater the power, the longer the shadow falls. Winston Churchill cast one of the longest shadows of the 20th century. It falls forward over the present, over the institutions he helped preserve, over the freedoms so many in the West take for granted because the line held, in 1940, in the rubble of a blitzed city, in the voice of one stubborn, brilliant, flawed, irreplaceable man. And it falls backward, too, over the graves in Bengal, over the decades of Indian subjugation, over all the places where the British Empire's idea of civilization delivered something else entirely. To stand in that shadow and pretend it is only light, that is not reverence. That is denial. To stand in that shadow and see only darkness, that is not justice. That is erasure. The truth is that the shadow contains both. That the history of powerful men and women almost always does. That this is not a reason to abandon the study of great lives, but a reason to study them more honestly, more completely, with more willingness to be made uncomfortable. Because the question this story asks, would I have made the same choice? Is not really about Winston Churchill. It is about you. About the assumptions you hold so deeply that you don't know you hold them. About the people who are not in the room when you make your decisions. About what you would sacrifice, and what you would overlook, if the weight of the world were on your shoulders and the bombs were falling, and the darkness was real, and you were the only one willing to stand up and say, "We shall never surrender." Churchill stood up, and something was saved, and something was lost. And the question of whether the man who saved civilization bears responsibility for the deaths that happened in civilization's shadow, that question does not have a clean answer. It has only this: pay attention to who is not in the room.